Imagine it is 1968. The Beatles have just released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Psychedelic music is everywhere. Bands are experimenting with sitars, tape loops, orchestras, sound effects. The summer of love has come and gone. Rock music is changing almost by the week. Then, out of nowhere, a guitar explodes from the radio. No orchestra, no psychedelic effects, no complicated production, just one dirty, swaggering, unmistakable guitar riff. Within seconds, you know exactly who's playing. The Rolling Stones are back. Today we're diving into 3 more songs that help define the greatest rock and roll band in history. We'll uncover the stories behind one of Keith Richards' greatest riffs, a song so controversial the band eventually stopped performing it, and the hit that almost never happened because nobody in the studio could agree on how it should sound. Along the way, we'll separate myths from reality, take you inside the recording sessions, and ask the same question musicians have been debating for decades. How did one band continue reinventing itself for more than 60 years? Before we begin, if you enjoy the stories behind classic rock's greatest songs, be sure to subscribe. Every week we go beyond the music to uncover the people, the arguments, the accidents, and the moments that changed rock history forever. Now let me ask you something. If someone played just one Rolling Stones guitar riff, could you identify it in the first 5 seconds? Keith Richards would probably smile at that question, because creating unforgettable riffs wasn't just part of his job. It became his signature. Our first song begins with footsteps, not in a recording studio, not on a concert stage, but outside an old English country house. By early 1968, life for the Rolling Stones had become complicated. Brian Jones, once the band's founder and musical leader, was becoming increasingly unreliable. Drug arrests had placed the group under intense media scrutiny. The British press seemed determined to paint them as the dangerous opposite of the Beatles. Meanwhile, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were carrying more and more of the songwriting responsibilities. The pressure was enormous. Then one morning, Keith Richards woke up at Redlands, his country home in Sussex. He heard someone walking outside, heavy boots crunching across the gravel. Keith looked toward the window and asked, "What's that?" His girlfriend Anita Pallenberg reportedly answered, "Oh, that's Jack. That's Jumpin' Jack." The man outside was believed to be Jack Dyer, the estate's gardener. Whether those exact words were spoken has become part of Rolling Stones folklore, but Keith himself has told versions of the story over the years. Whatever happened that morning, the phrase stayed in his mind. Jumpin' Jack. Sometimes inspiration arrives in the strangest ways. Now think about that for a second. One of the greatest titles in rock history may have started with a gardener walking to work. How many legendary songs are hiding inside completely ordinary moments? That's one of the things I love about songwriting. The biggest ideas don't always arrive in glamorous places. Sometimes they begin with someone looking out a window. The music itself represented another turning point. The Stones had spent the previous year exploring psychedelic sounds on their Satanic Majesty's request. Looking back, even members of the band admitted they were influenced by what other groups, especially the Beatles, were doing at the time. Keith Richards later suggested they had wandered a little too far from what made the Rolling Stones unique. Jumpin' Jack Flash was their way home. Back to blues, back to swagger, back to raw rock and roll. And it all began with one riff. Now here's something a lot of guitar players find fascinating. Keith didn't think like most lead guitarists. He wasn't trying to play faster than Eric Clapton, or more notes than Jeff Beck. He believed the perfect riff should be simple enough for anyone to recognize, but impossible for anyone else to improve. That's much harder than it sounds. The opening of Jumpin' Jack Flash feels almost effortless, yet generations of guitar players have spent decades trying to capture that exact feel. Not just the notes, the attitude. Because Keith understood something many musicians overlook. A great riff isn't just played, it has personality. Now here's a little-known studio story. Keith originally developed the riff on an acoustic Gibson Hummingbird guitar, not an electric. Producer Jimmy Miller encouraged the band to experiment with layering the acoustic alongside the electric guitars to create a thicker, more aggressive sound. That subtle production choice helped give Jumpin' Jack Flash its enormous presence. Many listeners assumed they were hearing walls of electric guitars. In reality, part of the magic came from an acoustic instrument hiding underneath the mix. Imagine sitting in that control room. Would you have guessed an acoustic guitar was helping create one of rock's toughest sounding records? Probably not. Sometimes the biggest sounds come from the least obvious places. Then there's Mick Jagger's lyric, "I was born in a crossfire hurricane." What an opening line. Over the years, fans have searched for hidden meanings. Was Mick writing about Keith? About himself? About the chaos surrounding the band? Or was it simply rock and roll poetry? The truth is probably a little of all those things. Mick has often written lyrics that paint vivid pictures without locking them into one specific meaning. That's one reason the song still feels fresh today. Every listener brings something different to it. One of my favorite myths surrounding Jumpin' Jack Flash is that it was secretly about drugs. While some fans have interpreted individual lines that way, neither Mick nor Keith has ever confirmed that explanation. More often, Keith described it as a song about surviving difficult times, escaping hardship, coming out stronger on the other side. Personally, I think that's why the song still connects with people. Everyone has had moments when life knocked them down. Everyone wants to believe they can get back up again. Now here's something you may not have noticed. Listen to Charlie Watts on this record. Charlie never tried to overwhelm the music. He played exactly what the song needed. No more. No less. Ask almost any drummer what made Charlie Watts so great, and they'll tell you the same thing. His feel. You can't teach feel. You either have it, or you spend your entire career chasing it. That's why Charlie remains one of the most respected drummers in rock history. When Jumpin' Jack Flash was released in May 1968, it immediately reminded fans why they had fallen in love with the Rolling Stones in the first place. The psychedelic experiment was over. The swagger had returned. And perhaps most importantly, the band had rediscovered its identity. But if Jumpin' Jack Flash reminded the world who the Rolling Stones were, the next song would make people argue about them for the next 50 years. And honestly, the debate still hasn't ended. The band had rediscovered its identity. But if Jumpin' Jack Flash reminded the world who the Rolling Stones were, the next song would make people argue about them for the next 50 years. And honestly, the debate still hasn't ended. That song is Brown Sugar. Now, before we even begin, let's acknowledge something. Brown Sugar is one of the greatest rock songs ever recorded. It's also one of the most controversial. Both of those things can be true at the same time. The song has one of Keith Richards' greatest riffs, one of Bobby Keys' finest saxophone performances, one of Mick Jagger's most energetic vocals. Yet today, it's discussed almost as much for its lyrics as it is for its music. We'll get to that story. But first, let's go back to where it all began. In late 1969, Mick Jagger was in Australia filming the movie Ned Kelly, where he played the infamous 19th century outlaw. Filming could be slow, long hours waiting around. Actors often carry notebooks because ideas arrive when you least expect them. One afternoon, Mick began writing lyrics. The melody came quickly. The groove was already taking shape in his head. Years later, Mick would say the song came together surprisingly fast. Some reports claim he finished the first draft in less than an hour. Others suggest it evolved over several days. Like many famous songwriting stories, the exact timeline depends on who's telling it. But one thing everyone agrees on: the song arrived unusually quickly. Now imagine sitting in your trailer between movie scenes and accidentally writing one of the biggest songs of your career. That's not a bad way to spend an afternoon. But writing the song and recording the song were two completely different experiences. The Rolling Stones entered Muscle Shoals Sound Studio in Alabama during December of 1969. If you're a fan of music history, Muscle Shoals is practically sacred ground. Aretha Franklin, Wilson Pickett, Percy Sledge, the Staple Singers. So many legendary artists walked through those doors. There was something special about that room. Musicians still talk about it today. Producer Jimmy Miller immediately understood what made Muscle Shoals unique. Instead of overthinking every note, he encouraged the band to capture the feel. Because great rock records aren't always technically perfect. Sometimes they're emotionally perfect. Keith Richards plugged in his guitar, locked into that unforgettable riff. Charlie Watts settled behind the drums. Bill Wyman's bass quietly anchored everything underneath. Then Bobby Keys walked into the studio carrying a saxophone. Now here's one of my favorite stories. Bobby Keys wasn't just another session musician. He and Keith Richards became lifelong friends. They shared birthdays, shared adventures, and according to countless stories, shared more than a few unforgettable nights together. Bobby's saxophone solo sounds completely effortless, like he simply wandered into the room, played exactly the right notes, and walked back out again. Of course, it wasn't that simple. Great musicians often make difficult things sound easy. That's part of the illusion. Now here's something most listeners never notice. Keith Richards wasn't playing guitar the way most rock guitarists did. By this point, he'd fully embraced open G tuning, Instead of using the standard 6-string setup, Keith often removed the lowest string altogether and tuned the remaining strings into an open G chord. That allowed him to create those huge, rolling rhythms that became one of the defining sounds of the Rolling Stones. Ask guitar players what makes Keith Richards unique, and open G tuning almost always enters the conversation. But here's the important part. Open G wasn't magic. Plenty of musicians have tried it. Very few sound like Keith Richards. The tuning helped. The feel did the rest. Now let's talk about the lyrics. This is where the conversation becomes much more complicated. Over the years, listeners have interpreted Brown Sugar in many different ways. Some hear it as commentary on slavery. Others hear references to interracial relationships. Still others focus on drug imagery. The song blends historical references, provocative language, and Mick Jagger's trademark style of writing in characters rather than speaking literally. Mick himself has admitted that some of the lyrics make him uncomfortable today. In interviews, he said that if he were writing the song now, he probably wouldn't write it the same way. That's an honest reflection that many artists eventually face. Times change, audiences change, and sometimes the way a song is understood changes too. Here's the reality. For decades, Brown Sugar remained one of the highlights of every Rolling Stones concert. Fans expected it. It became almost impossible to imagine a Stones show without it. Then something changed. In 2021, the band quietly stopped performing the song during their U.S. tour. Immediately, rumors exploded. Some people claimed the band had been canceled. Others insisted record companies forced the decision. Neither story was accurate. Keith Richards later expressed that he still loved playing the song and questioned whether audiences truly wanted it removed. Mick Jagger took a different view, suggesting that the lyrics no longer landed the way they once had and that it was time to let the song rest. That's an important distinction. There wasn't one dramatic moment. There wasn't a ban. It was a decision made within the band. Whether you agree with it or not, it's part of the song's history. Now let me ask you something. Can a song remain a masterpiece, even if parts of it become uncomfortable with time? Or should every generation judge music only by today's standards? There isn't an easy answer. And that's exactly why people are still debating Brown Sugar more than 50 years after it was recorded. That's what great art often does. It starts conversations, sometimes uncomfortable ones, but conversations nonetheless. One thing almost nobody argues about is the performance itself. Charlie Watts is absolutely locked in. Keith Richards sounds fearless. Bobby Keys delivers one of the greatest saxophone breaks in rock history. And Mick Jagger attacks every line with complete confidence. It's one of those records where every musician seems to understand exactly what the song needs. No one overplays. No one holds back. Everything works. Released in 1971 as the opening track on Sticky Fingers, the song raced to the top of the charts. It became another defining moment in the Rolling Stones' remarkable career. But while Brown Sugar became one of the band's biggest hits, the final song in today's episode almost didn't survive long enough to be released at all. In fact, the band recorded it over and over again, then walked away from it. For years, most groups would have forgotten it. Keith Richards couldn't. Most groups would have forgotten it. Keith Richards couldn't. The song was Start Me Up. Now here's one of my favorite what-if stories in rock history. What if I told you one of the biggest songs of the 1980s was almost left sitting on a shelf forever? Because that's exactly what happened. The story begins in 1975 during sessions for the album Black and Blue. Keith Richards had a new riff. Everyone agreed it had potential. The problem was, nobody could agree on what kind of song it should become. Believe it or not, the first versions weren't straight rock songs at all. They leaned heavily toward reggae. If you've listened to Keith Richards over the years, you know his love of reggae runs deep. He wasn't trying to imitate the music. He genuinely admired it. So the band spent hours, then days, trying to make the song work. Version after version was recorded. Some sources say there were more than 40 complete takes. Others claim there may have been as many as 70 partial attempts. Whatever the exact number, one thing is certain, they couldn't make it work. Imagine sitting in the control room, take after take, day after day, and every version feels almost right, but not quite. Have you ever worked on something that just refused to come together? A project, a business, a relationship? Sometimes, no matter how hard you push, the timing simply isn't right. That's exactly where Start Me Up found itself. Eventually, the band gave up. The tapes were boxed. The song was forgotten. Or at least, most of the band forgot about it. Keith Richards didn't. Years later, While preparing material for Tattoo You, producer Chris Kimsey began digging through old recording tapes looking for unfinished songs. Tattoo You wasn't originally supposed to contain a lot of new material. The Rolling Stones had accumulated years of unreleased recordings. The idea was simple. Find the hidden gems. One afternoon, someone played those old Start Me Up tapes again. This time, instead of forcing the song into a reggae groove, Keith sped it up. Everything changed. Sometimes, a song isn't wrong. It's simply waiting for the right version. Now imagine being Chris Kimsey that day. You hear a song everyone had already abandoned. Then suddenly, the riff clicks. The drums lock in. The energy appears almost instantly. That's one of the greatest gifts a producer can have. Knowing when to stop chasing one idea and start chasing another. Here's something many people don't realize. Producers don't just press record. The best producers become another creative voice inside the room. Jimmy Miller had done it for years with the Stones. Chris Kimsey helped carry that tradition into the next era. Now let's talk about that opening riff. It's impossible to mistake, like Jumpin Jack Flash. The riff feels simple, but try playing it exactly the way Keith Richards does. That's where things become much more difficult. Keith once joked that he wasn't interested in playing hundreds of notes. He wanted every note to matter. That's a philosophy that influenced generations of guitar players. Tom Petty, the Black Crowes, Aerosmith, Guns N' Roses, countless garage bands. Because once you learn that a great riff doesn't have to be complicated, everything changes. Then Mick Jagger enters. If You Start Me Up, instantly, the song feels enormous, confident, playful, alive. Now here's another story that almost sounds too strange to be true. In 1995, Microsoft licensed Start Me Up to launch Windows 95. The reported licensing fee has been debated for years, with estimates ranging into the millions of dollars. Whatever the exact amount, it was one of the highest profile uses of a rock song in advertising at the time. Think about that for a moment. A song that nearly disappeared forever ends up introducing one of the biggest technology products in history. You couldn't invent a better ending. Now here's something I've always found fascinating about the Rolling Stones. Every decade, someone predicts they're finished. In the late 1960s, people wondered if they could survive the psychedelic era. In the 1970s, people questioned whether they could stay together. By the early 1980s, critics were asking if younger bands had passed them by. Then Start Me Up arrived. And suddenly, the Rolling Stones weren't a nostalgia act. They were still making stadium-sized rock records. That's incredibly difficult. Very few bands remain relevant across 3 different decades. Even fewer manage 4. Now let me ask you something. If you had been in that studio, after 40 failed recordings, would you have kept trying, or would you have thrown the tapes away? History often belongs to the people who refuse to quit one take too soon. And that's exactly what happened here. Now let's step back and look at these 3 songs together. Jumpin Jack Flash, a band rediscovering who they really were. Brown Sugar, a masterpiece that still sparks debate half a century later. Start Me Up, proof that great songs sometimes need years before they're ready. 3 songs, 3 completely different stories, yet they all reveal something about the Rolling Stones that many people overlook. Their greatest strength wasn't simply writing great songs. It was surviving. They survived changing musical trends. They survived personal tragedy. They survived lineup changes. They survived criticism. They survived decades when everyone expected them to disappear. That's why their story is bigger than rock and roll. It's about resilience, about refusing to quit, about believing the next great song might still be waiting around the corner. And maybe that's the greatest lesson the Rolling Stones have left us. The next chapter is never written until you decide to write it. Now I want to hear from you. Did we choose the right 3 songs? Or would your list include Beast of Burden, Miss You, Angie, Tumbling Dice, or maybe Waiting on a Friend? Tell me your 3 favorites in the comments. I'm already thinking there may have to be a part 3, because narrowing the Rolling Stones down to just a handful of songs might be one of the hardest challenges in classic rock. After all, we're talking about a band that's been writing history for more than 60 years. Until next time, relax, spark one up, and keep that turntable spinning.